The year is 30 BC. Inside a tomb in the conquered city of Alexandria, the end has come for Cleopatra. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh and the finality of defeat. The world's wealthiest monarch, a ruler revered as a living goddess, a direct descendant of Alexander the Great's most trusted general, is now a prisoner in her own capital. Outside, the disciplined tramp of Roman legions echoes through the streets her ancestors built. The legions of her enemy, Octavian, are in absolute control. The Roman general she had allied with, Marc Antony, the man with whom she had dreamed of forging an Eastern empire, is dead. His blood still fresh on the stones of the city. Her kingdom, an ancient and proud civilization that had endured for 3 millennia, is now merely a province of Rome. Her children, the heirs to a divine and royal lineage, are captives. Her entire world, a vibrant tapestry of power, intellect, and ambition, is lost. In this final moment, she is not just a defeated queen. She is the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last major monarch of the Hellenistic world, the final, formidable barrier that stood between a fractured Roman Republic and the dawn of a new absolute Roman Empire. The story of her downfall, recorded by Roman historians like Cassius Dio, became the final word on her life for centuries. It presents a simple, tragic narrative, a love affair of such intensity that it brought 2 empires to war and ended in ruin. It is a story of a queen undone by her passions. The Roman poets who wrote in the shadow of her defeat, men like Horace and Propertius, helped to cement this image. They wrote of a fatal monster, a harlot queen, so consumed by luxury and lust that she threatened the very fabric of Roman civilization. This was the story the victors needed the world to believe, a justification for conquest that transformed a powerful political rival into a moral cautionary tale. Yet this official history was constructed by her conqueror. It obscures a more complex political reality, one in which Cleopatra's true transgression may not have been love, but ambition. The legend of the seductress was the perfect justification for a war of conquest, a powerful myth designed to conceal the calculated destruction of a brilliant political rival who stood as the final obstacle to one man's total domination of the known world. Her story is not just the story of a woman. It is the story of the birth of the Roman Empire and the death of the Hellenistic age. To uncover the truth of her life, one must begin at her death and deconstruct the very foundations of the story the victor told. To understand the queen, one must first understand the city that produced her. Alexandria was a marvel, the intellectual and cultural capital of the Mediterranean world. Founded by Alexander the Great, it was a cosmopolitan metropolis where towering white marble buildings met the azure sea. Its harbor was dominated by the pharaohs, a legendary lighthouse that was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was home to the museum, a proto-university, and the Great Library, a vast repository of human knowledge containing hundreds of thousands of scrolls. In its streets, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and people from across the known world mingled, traded, and debated. It was a city of immense wealth, staggering beauty, and profound learning. This was the city Cleopatra was born to rule. But the throne she was to inherit was built on a foundation of blood. She was Cleopatra VII, the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Historians like Dwayne Roller describe the Ptolemaic court as a place where survival depended on a mixture of ruthlessness and political acumen. The family tree was drenched in blood. Brothers murdered sisters for the throne. Mothers murdered sons. Her own great-grandmother, a queen also named Cleopatra, had her own son, the ruling king, murdered because he was growing too independent. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, or the flute player, ruled a kingdom already in decline. His grip on power was so weak that he was driven from his throne and forced into exile in Rome, where the young Cleopatra likely witnessed firsthand his humiliation as he begged and borrowed, spending a fortune to bribe senators for their support. His eventual return to Alexandria at the head of a Roman army was a bloody affair. Upon reclaiming his throne, he promptly had his own ruling daughter, Berenice, executed. This was the environment that shaped Cleopatra. She witnessed that power was precarious, family was dangerous, and the key to survival in Egypt often lay in the hands of powerful men in Rome. It taught her a fundamental lesson. Power is never securely given, but must always be decisively taken. But that was just one of the threats inside the palace walls. The Ptolemies had a tradition designed to keep power locked within the family, a practice inherited from the ancient pharaohs. To rule, a Ptolemaic queen had to marry a male co-ruler, typically her own brother. Upon her father's death, the 18-year-old Cleopatra was immediately bound by this tradition. She was officially married and made co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII. This was not a union of partners, but a stark political maneuver. It placed a brilliant and ambitious young woman in a co-rulership with a child, one who would inevitably become a pawn for the powerful men at court, men like the eunuch Pothinus, who despised her strength and independence and ultimately drove her into exile. For Cleopatra, refusal was not an option. To reject the marriage would have been to reject her father's will and Ptolemaic law, instantly marking her as a usurper and giving her enemies the perfect pretext to ignite a civil war against her. And after her first brother husband was defeated and killed in the war against Caesar, Roman pressure and Ptolemaic tradition forced her, now 22, into yet another politically necessary marriage, this time to her even younger brother, the 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV. This relentless cycle of forced, dangerous unions taught Cleopatra a core lesson that would define her entire reign. Marriage within her own family was a deadly political arena. It cemented in her a worldview where alliances must be based not on tradition or affection, but on overwhelming, undeniable strategic power. Beyond the palace walls, an even greater threat loomed: Rome. By the mid-1st century BC, after centuries of relentless expansion, the Roman Republic was the undisputed superpower. It was a state defined by conflict, and its politics were dominated by ambitious generals who commanded personal armies and vied for ultimate power. Egypt, with its legendary wealth, was a target of immense strategic value. It was a treasure house with failing defenses. Having been driven into exile by her brother's advisors, Cleopatra was now a queen in name only. Hunted by her own family, she was an outcast with no resources, no army, and no allies. All that she possessed was her lineage, her intellect, and that profound understanding of the brutal game of power she had been born into. Her situation was desperate, but desperation would fuel an act of immense audacity, a gamble to secure an audience with the one man in Alexandria who could restore her to the throne, Julius Caesar. The legend of Cleopatra as a wicked seductress was not born in a vacuum. Even before Octavian's systematic campaign, The Roman elite viewed her with deep suspicion. The great orator Cicero, writing in his letters after meeting her in Rome during her stay as Caesar's guest, refused to even use her name, referring to her only as the Queen, with palpable disdain. He complained of her arrogance, noting her interest in his private library as a sign of intellectual presumption. To men like Cicero, she was an intellectual equal, a powerful foreign monarch, and a woman, a combination that deeply unsettled the patriarchal Roman aristocracy. Roman tradition, the mos maiorum, or way of the ancestors, was deeply suspicious of Eastern luxury, foreign influence, and especially powerful, independent women in politics. A Roman woman's power was expected to be exercised quietly within the home. Cleopatra commanded fleets and treasuries in her own name. She represented all three of their greatest fears. This existing prejudice became the fertile ground for her true nemesis, a man who would rise to power in the chaotic aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian. When he first appears in the historical record, he is a physically frail but intensely ambitious teenager. He was Caesar's great-nephew, and in a move that shocked the Roman world, Caesar's will named this untested boy as his adopted son and primary heir. Upon Caesar's death, he boldly took the name Gaius Julius Caesar, linking himself forever to the legacy of the great dictator. While Antony commanded legions through loyalty, Octavian commanded them with Caesar's money and, more importantly, Caesar's name. This legal and financial power, which he wielded with ruthless efficiency, made him a formidable player from the very beginning. Octavian was not a charismatic general like Caesar or a famed warrior like Antony. He was a master of a different kind of warfare, the war of information, of public perception, of propaganda. His mind was his greatest weapon, and he wielded it with cold, calculating precision. In the power struggle that followed Caesar's death, Octavian faced off against his rival, Marc Antony. Many modern historians, including Adrian Goldsworthy, suggest Octavian's genius was to transform what was essentially a Roman civil war into a foreign one. He knew a direct attack on the popular Antony was politically dangerous. Instead, he attacked him through Cleopatra. This was the how of the propaganda war. Through his agents in Rome, Octavian commissioned a relentless barrage of slander that painted Cleopatra as the embodiment of anti-Roman values. She was portrayed as a drunken harlot who worshipped monstrous animal-headed gods. Stories were spread of her testing poisons on slaves for amusement. They called her a witch who used magic to enslave men, and a decadent despot who dreamed of conquering Rome and establishing a new capital in Alexandria. Every lie was crafted to make her seem alien, immoral, and dangerously powerful. This caricature allowed Octavian to frame his war not as a grab for power, but as a righteous crusade to save the Roman Republic from a foreign threat. To understand the alliance that would so enrage the Roman elite, we must return to Alexandria in 48 BC. The man Cleopatra gambled everything to meet, Gaius Julius Caesar, was at the apex of his power. He was 52 years old, a brilliant and ruthless general who had just conquered Gaul. He was a populist politician, an author, and a man of boundless ambition. He had just defeated his great rival, Pompey the Great, effectively winning a bloody civil war. He arrived in Egypt hot on Pompey's trail, only to be presented with his rival's severed head, an act ordered by Cleopatra's brother that horrified Caesar. He was now the arbiter of Egypt's fate, and he desperately needed money. Cleopatra's solution for reaching him was a masterstroke: the story. made famous by the ancient biographer Plutarch, is one of history's great theatrical moments. Cleopatra, smuggled past enemy lines rolled in a carpet, emerging at the feet of the Roman general. But as the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer Stacy Schiff suggests, this was a masterpiece of calculated audacity. It was less about seduction and more about gaining access. It was a brilliant maneuver to bypass an army and prove she was a bold and serious player. Their meeting ignited a conflict. Her brother's advisors launched an attack on Caesar's small force. For months, Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the royal palace. The resulting Alexandrian War was a brutal, close-quarters affair, with desperate fighting in the city's streets. At one point, Caesar's library ship was set ablaze in the harbor, and the fire spread, tragically damaging the great library itself. Caesar himself nearly died, forced to leap from a causeway and swim to safety under a hail of arrows. It was in this crucible of fire and war that their bond was forged. After Roman reinforcements finally arrived and her brother's army was crushed, Caesar restored Cleopatra to the throne. Their partnership was cemented by a legendary 2-month cruise down the Nile. On a magnificent royal barge, they toured Egypt in a display of power, solidifying her rule. Soon after, their son was born, Ptolemy Caesar, known as Caesarion. Cleopatra later traveled to Rome, living in Caesar's private villa across the Tiber. Her presence caused a scandal, but Caesar made an even bolder statement. He placed a golden statue of her, depicted as the goddess Isis, in his new temple to Venus Genetrix, the mythical ancestor of his own family. It was a shocking public declaration of their bond, an act that further alienated the conservative Roman Senate. Caesarion was not just a love child. He was a claim to a global legacy, a living symbol of a future that terrified Rome. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 BC shattered Cleopatra's long-term strategy. Her Roman protector was gone, and her position, along with that of her son Caesarion, was once again precarious. The Roman world was plunged into another vicious civil war. Out of the chaos, a new ruling triumvirate emerged to hunt down Caesar's assassins and govern the state. Caesar's calculating heir, Octavian, a senior general named Lepidus, and Caesar's most loyal right-hand man, Marc Antony. Antony was in many ways the opposite of Octavian. He was a charismatic and legendary battlefield commander, a man of huge appetites for food, drink, and glory, beloved by his soldiers, but often impulsive and politically naive. As part of a fragile truce that divided the Roman world between them, Antony took control of Rome's rich and glamorous eastern provinces, the lands that bordered Cleopatra's Egypt. In 41 BC, he summoned the queen to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey to account for her actions during the war and, more practically, to secure her financial support for his own planned invasion of the Parthian Empire, Rome's greatest rival in the East. The story of their first meeting has become one of history's most enduring romantic images. As recorded by the ancient biographer Plutarch, Cleopatra did not hurry to Antony's side. Instead, she made him wait, building anticipation for her arrival. She sailed up the river Cydnus not in a warship, but in a magnificent golden barge, propelled by silver oars and guided by vast purple sails. Perfumes and incense wafted from the vessel to the crowds that lined the riverbanks. On deck, Cleopatra herself was reclining under a gilded canopy, dressed in the robes of the goddess Venus Aphrodite, fanned by attendants costumed as cupids. She was not merely a queen arriving for a meeting. She was a goddess manifesting before a mortal. The spectacle was so overwhelming that Antony, the Roman general who had summoned her, was left waiting alone in the public square as the entire city flocked to the river to witness her arrival. But beneath the spectacle was a calculated and brilliant political message. This was not the act of a woman attempting to seduce a man. It was a monarch demonstrating her power to a potential ally. Antony had summoned her as a subordinate, but she arrived as a peer. By forcing him to leave his tribunal and attend a banquet on her ship, she inverted the power dynamic of their meeting. More importantly, this lavish display was a direct answer to Antony's most pressing need: money. Antony required a colossal fortune to fund his legions for the war with Parthia. Cleopatra, by arriving in a vessel that seemed fashioned from treasure itself, was demonstrating that she possessed what he desperately required. She was establishing the terms of their negotiation before a single word of it had begun. What followed was a partnership that would alter the course of Roman history. Antony spent the winter of 41 to 40 BC in Alexandria, and the alliance that was forged there was one of both political pragmatism and genuine personal affection. They famously formed a social club known as the Inimitable Livers, hosting lavish banquets and engaging in public carousing, a lifestyle that was both a genuine expression of their personalities and a form of political theater. Yet, this initial affair was put on hold by the urgent demands of Roman politics. Tensions between Antony and Octavian had reached a boiling point. To avert another civil war, a new pact was forged, and the seal for this alliance was marriage. Antony agreed to wed Octavian's elder sister, Octavia. Octavia was the embodiment of Roman virtue, dignified, loyal, and respected. For several years, Antony governed the East from Athens with Octavia by his side, and a fragile peace settled over the Roman world as they had 2 daughters. But the preparations for his massive invasion of Parthia drew him to his military headquarters in Antioch. It was from there, in 37 BC, that he once again summoned Cleopatra, needing her vast resources to fund his army. The final break became a humiliating public spectacle a few years later. Octavia, ever the dutiful wife, was sailing from Italy with reinforcements and supplies. Antony sent messengers to intercept her in Athens with a blunt and chilling order: send the troops and supplies on, but she herself was to return to Rome. This public dismissal of Octavian's sister was an unforgivable insult. Antony was openly choosing his Eastern queen and her kingdom over his Roman wife and his obligations to the state. It was a monumental political statement, and the ultimate piece of ammunition his rival, Octavian, had been waiting for. For the next decade, Antony and Cleopatra were the power couple of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their partnership was deeply personal. They would have 3 children together, but it was also a formidable political and military alliance. Antony's disastrous invasion of Parthia only deepened his reliance on her. His army was shattered by the terrain and enemy attacks, and it was Cleopatra's gold and supplies that saved it from complete annihilation, a fact that earned her the adoration of his soldiers and the eternal scorn of his rivals in Rome. Together, they shared a vision of a new Hellenistic Roman Empire, a hybrid power based in the East, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. This vision stood in stark opposition to the traditional Rome-centric view held by Octavian. The culmination of this shared ambition occurred in 34 BC, in a lavish public ceremony known as the Donations of Alexandria. In front of a massive crowd, Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. Antony declared Caesarion to be the true, legitimate son of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian's legitimacy as Caesar's adopted son. He then proclaimed his own children with Cleopatra as the monarchs of vast eastern territories, with Alexander Helios named king of Armenia and Ptolemy Philadelphus king of Syria. To the Senate and people of Rome, this was an unforgivable act of treason. Octavian, the master propagandist, seized upon the donations as the ultimate proof of his long-standing claims. He presented Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity, a general who had gone native and was now merely the consort of a foreign despot. The historian Cassius Dio recorded the outrage in the city, where Antony was seen as a man who had given away Roman territory at the behest of his foreign mistress. The final stroke of Octavian's character assassination came when he illegally seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read its contents aloud to the Senate. The will allegedly confirmed Antony's declaration of Caesarion as Caesar's true heir, and most damningly, expressed his desire to be buried not in Rome, but in Alexandria, beside Cleopatra. This act, more than any other, galvanized Roman sentiment against him. A Roman hero wished to be buried on foreign soil. The betrayal felt absolute. With public opinion now firmly behind him, Octavian had the justification he needed. The simmering civil war was masterfully reframed as a foreign war, a defense of Roman values against a corrupt Eastern queen and her bewitched Roman puppet. The final catastrophic confrontation was now inevitable. The legacy of the propaganda was to completely erase the real woman. But modern scholarship allows us to piece her back together. To see her as the Romans did is to miss the point of her entirely. We must see her as she saw herself, not as a client of Rome, but as the sovereign of the wealthiest, oldest, and most cultured kingdom in the Mediterranean. Her capital, Alexandria, was the intellectual center of the world, home to the Great Library and the Museum, a proto-university of poets, scientists, and philosophers. This was her world, and she was its master. Far from the Roman caricature, Cleopatra was a formidable intellectual. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to take the time to learn the native Egyptian language. Egyptologists like Joanne Fletcher stress the importance of this act. It was a profound statement of intent, signaling her commitment to ruling not just as a Greek queen, but as a true Egyptian pharaoh. She embraced the ancient religious traditions of her country, presenting herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, mother of all. This was not just theater, it was brilliant politics, forging a bond with her millions of native Egyptian subjects, a power base that no Roman could touch. She participated in native religious festivals, and reliefs at temples like Dendera show her making offerings to Egyptian gods, depicted in the traditional style of a pharaoh. Her intellect was not confined to politics. She was a patron of the sciences, and ancient medical texts attribute various recipes and treatments to her, suggesting a practical knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology. As a sovereign, she was a skilled administrator. She inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse and managed its economy for over 2 decades. She reformed the currency, fought corruption, and launched trade expeditions to Arabia and India, understanding that Egypt's future lay not just in its relationship with Rome, but in a global economy. During a devastating famine, when the Nile failed to flood, she opened the royal granaries to feed her people, an act that cemented their loyalty. This was the real Cleopatra, a multilingual scholar, a skilled economist, a popular pharaoh, and a brilliant political strategist. This was the woman who Octavian needed to bury under a mountain of slander. The true threat she posed was not her beauty, but her competence. The final war was inevitable. After the catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Actium, the end came quickly. Antony, descending into despair and betrayed by a false report of her death, committed a botched suicide, dying in her arms. With Octavian's forces at the gates of Alexandria, Cleopatra entered her family mausoleum. Her final meeting with the Roman victor was a last, desperate negotiation. She tried to secure her kingdom for her children. He tried to keep her alive to be the star attraction in his victory parade in Rome. Realizing his promises were empty, she made her final choice. She would not be humiliated. She would not be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome as a symbol of his victory. In her death, as in her life, she would control her own destiny. Her suicide, famously by the bite of an asp, was her last act of defiance. Octavian, soon to be the Emperor Augustus, had won. He had conquered her kingdom, and now he would conquer her story. His version of history, the story of a Roman hero corrupted by a foreign witch, became the official record. Her eldest son, Caesarion, was hunted down and executed, his claim to Caesar's bloodline too dangerous to let stand. Her 3 children with Antony were spared, taken to Rome to be raised by Octavia, the very wife their father had abandoned. The propaganda was so effective that it was adopted by later Roman historians, immortalized by Shakespeare, and ultimately inherited by Hollywood. Shakespeare's masterpiece, while a work of genius, cemented her image in the Western world as a figure of infinite variety, a woman whose titanic passions overrode her political judgment. This romanticized figure, in turn, paved the way for the hypersexualized depictions of the 20th century. Her story reveals a recurring pattern in history, where powerful female rulers, from Hatshepsut to Elizabeth I to Catherine the Great, are often defined by their gender and sexuality, their competence and ambition reframed as unnatural or monstrous. The woman Octavian tried to bury under a mountain of slander remains a subject of intense fascination. Her enemies wanted to write the final chapter of her story, to define her for all time as a warning against female ambition. And yet, more than 2,000 years later, we find ourselves still asking, who was the real Cleopatra?